This is Season 1, Episode 5 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. The episode tonight, Pitfalls with Pets and Companions in Role-Playing Games. Or those goddamn familiars. Welcome to Mastering the RPG. Like I said, a tabletop RPG podcast focusing on maximizing your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master, doesn't matter if you're a player, we got advice, ideas, cool stuff, and some pretty strong opinions. And I think you've heard that if you've been listening before. But we hope you get something out of it. I'm Carl with my co-host Eric and James. And you can find information about us at masteringtherepg.com. And if you've got questions, feedback, email, or you want us to adjudicate a question, an argument, whatever, you can contact us at GameMaster@masteringtherepg.com. And those are both all one word. So let's get right into it, gentlemen. Hey, good evening, Eric and James. How you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Eric's audio just dropped out. I'm going well. Hi, I'm James. Going well.
All right. I surprised him. My fault. Okay. So today we're going to start with Eric's got something pretty cool. Cool stuff. Come on, go with me. Cool stuff. Yeah. We have cool stuff found. Do you copy? Cool stuff found. Over. Yeah. So Eric, take it away. What did you find?
All right. Well, this episode, I should say, I'm bringing you guys a really cool, casual kind of party-ish game called Noisy Person's Card, or I think it's, Noisy Person Cards, or NPC, funny enough, by James D'Amato, who people might know out there, the guy who does One Shot podcast, the Campaign podcast, really, really cool improviser and gamer. He also written a bunch of books. But this was something that I kickstarted way back. I don't even remember how long ago this was. I think it was 2014 or something. And I don't actually have the print version. I got the kind of PDF cut yourself the cards version of it, which I did. But yeah, it's a really cool casual party game that's the target audience is really for role players, but it can be fun for a lot of people, anybody who's interested in improv or acting. The basic of the game is just to make silly voices and to kind of expand what kind of voices you could make. It's to kind of give you inspiration and stretch what you normally do. You know, we always get kind of stuck in the ruts of these are my kind of base voices, and this really kind of expands that. So very basically, there's two types of cards in the game. One is a character card, which in the version that I have is either a picture with a description under it of a character or just a description. Something like, you know, a gnoll or something, or a pirate queen. There's also stuff like kobolds, grand vizier. There's a sex demon, beaver. Now this is an all ages family game, or I should say like 7, 12 plus, and I'll explain why. Now the newer printed versions that I looked up, I think they're just pictures. I don't think there's any more descriptions on them. But yeah, there's character cards, and then there's phrase cards. And the phrase cards have a phrase on them that's something like a quote of a character might say. And then at the bottom of those kind of inverse is a little descriptor, which I'll explain about. And the phrases are pretty fun. The whole thing is pretty tongue-in-cheek. I mean, we have stuff like, I'll read some examples here. I'm going to toss this coin in the air. When it hits the ground, you're going to be dead or out of my sight. Choose wisely. Or, I'm a kleptomancer. I talk to stolen objects, then return them to their original owners. So it's just kind of all over here's another one. What if the missiles really aren't magic? So all over the place, tongue-in-cheek. There's a ton of jokes. There's a ton of... I'm spacing out now. What's the lowest form of humor? Puns, sorry. Pun type things. A lot of pickup lines. The cool thing about this is to make it all ages... A bunch of them have a little skull icon on the bottom, like a funny little skull icon, and you can just take those out, and then it's kind of more family friendly. But yeah, there's those two types of cards, and everybody draws a hand of those phrase cards, and then one person starts as the judge, and they pick a character card, and that's the character that everybody's gonna have to make a voice for. Then the judge will then take one of the descriptors that he has. So on the phrase cards, the descriptor, kind of like, saucy could be one. An example in the book is dreamy. So if the character was a kobold that you had, you would then take the card, it would become a dreamy kobold. And then everybody around the table, all the players, would then pick one of their phrases and then have to speak that phrase in whatever they think a dreamy kobold would sound like.
Oh, wow.
And then the judge then can decide who's the winner. Now it gets a little bit crazier here, is that if so that kind of upping the ante, like I said, that's a game mode where the judge adds that descriptor, like I said. So it can just be a character, but he can add one of those descriptors. But if the judge can't decide, or thinks 2 people or 3 people need to go more at it, they can have a duel, which everybody who's in the duel then gets to also up the ante for themselves and add another descriptor, just to kind of make it even more. So that dreamy kobold could become an equine dreamy kobold, or a drunk dreamy kobold. So there's all these crazy ones, and then it can just keep adding on. And if you wanted to pass around, you just put in a card and add another descriptor. So you can kind of get crazy and then kind of really stretch it. So even though you gave your, the voice for one of the characters, adding on the descriptor kind of adds a new element and will kind of challenge you in that way. And then basically once the judge decides, okay, that person's won, they get all the cards. And then whoever has the most cards at the end of a round wins, or the end of a turn, or whatever you decide. The game is pretty casual. They kind of say, do it when everybody has gone, or do it when you run out of phrases, or do it when the beer runs out. This is not meant to be like a winner.
So it's like apples to apples for voice acting.
Exactly like apples to apples. And it kind of plays also like Cards for Humanity sort of too.
Oh, sure.
But again, it's not meant to be, there's not, in the way when I bring up Cards of Humanity, where it kind of has that same thing where somebody chooses a card and then it's very subjective. It's that similar thing. I think with this game, I played it only a couple times, but it was really fun when I did. It did help me, get more creative with voices. It's hard to find a group that will be into it. And you really have to have the right group for this, because, people, compared to Apples and Apples or Cards Against Humanity, these are people that are being creative, and then you're judging them kind of based on that. So you definitely have to have a good group where people are, more open to that and not being so offended maybe by somebody saying, oh, this person did a better job or whatever. I mean, because it's not really about that. The job is that you're doing a silly voice, right? There can be definitely a little bit, the descriptors can get too crazy. I think putting a limit on it, at least what I found, was a good idea. But overall, I think it's a really, really, really fun and really, really good way to like increase your role playing, because, even people who are into role playing, like all me and my lovely host here, it's sometimes good to still mix it up, because we get stuck in the same archetypes, the same characters, right? The same voices. I mean, my kobold voice is my kobold voice generally.
It almost like we did a podcast earlier about this exact topic. So
yeah, it's really cool for that. Now it's a little bit hard to find. You can still buy it online, the print version. I think it's like $15 or something. So definitely worth it, I think. Also, if you have Tabletop Simulator, somebody did make a module for it that I think still works. So, cool. Right there, you can just play online with people doing Tabletop Simulator. So, yeah, any questions from you guys or comments?
Adding spice to your Zoom drinking session. Do that while you're playing Tabletop.
Yes, I think drinking also, that adds another element to it for sure. It loosens up a lot.
Sounds like a great warm-up exercise for if you're a heavily role-playing group. If you're into it already, good way to get those creative juices going and the vocal cords kind of running. Sounds great.
Yeah, or even if you're not a heavy role-playing group, it might be a good way to
encourage it to begin.
Go into those places, yeah. So, yeah, really cool. Encourage people to check it out.
Yeah, I'm pretty impressed at what it could bring. And I was joking when I said it was apples to apples for voice acting. I think it's more than
that is,
probably more than that. But it's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I think we should, not on the podcast, but I think we should try it with our group, Eric, and just have a good time. Just try it out.
Or it's good. We can do it as a bonus. Yeah. We can have a Patreon bonus or something. We can all do it. Maybe. Who knows? Yeah, we'll see.
I'll have a go for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Sounds good. All right. Look at that. All right. So that is a really good, cool thing that Eric found. And then now we'll go on to the main topic.
Mastering the RPG with Carl, Eric, and James. Yeah.
All right, we're here with the main topic, and I'm going to throw this over to James, who has the strong opinion on familiars, but we'll let him go ahead and talk about that.
Goddamn familiars. No, look, it's a strong topic. I do have some strong opinions on this one, but I thought it'd be a good little time to have a bit of a chat and a bit of a discussion about this phenomena that is happening in role-playing games. And I've got to say, it's a phenomena that that's been around for a long time, but probably nuanced and changed, particularly in 5th edition, but I'm seeing it pop up in a lot of role-playing games now. And that is this concept of the player-controlled non-player character. Most commonly in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the familiar, but it can often be an animal companion for a ranger, or it could be a clockwork companion for an artificer, or it could be, if we're talking something like Call of Cthulhu, it could be a retainer, like a butler or a driver or a kind of handy person that you have alongside them. It's about this kind of explosion of the use of these, how you can use them, tips and tricks on how they're effective, what's some pitfalls about having these player-controlled non-player characters, and then what happens if it all goes horribly wrong in terms of so many that you can barely manage them. I've had some experiences in that one, I guess. So in a lot of ways, for me, this is certainly increasing a lot in the games and in the groups that I run. Find Familiar is an extraordinarily common spell. It's a level 1 spell that you can use. So for me, it's something that a lot of players have been getting access to, which means that all of a sudden you've got another element that you have to manage within a game, where a player particularly kind of latches on to a non-player character, a familiar, or a pet, a companion of some description. Of course, I play a lot of games with kids, so that occurs semi-regularly for me, but I'm finding it in adult games too. So in a lot of ways, I'm kind of looking for some opinions here, some how do you use them, some tips and tricks to use them. Again, I put it out to a lot of Dungeon Masters I know, and most of them kind of shared a level of frustration about this, but I guess over to you guys a little bit. How familiar are you with familiars? How often do these pop up in your games? Any ideas, any tips and tricks on how to manage them better, how to manage them well?
Well, so I will fully admit that from a fantasy standpoint, I haven't run into familiars a lot because I don't do a lot of D&D 5th edition, and back in 1st edition when I did do a lot of D&D, there wasn't a lot to it, to be quite honest with you. There was a lot more around hiring hirelings and henchmen to go into a dungeon with you, and a lot of that was, Gary decided that the game master should run those things for you, anything of any sort of power, and so that's how he decided to take care of it. But honestly, in other genres like science fiction or superpowers, you have that same problem, right? There can be people who are with you as partners. Obviously, we get the sidekick in a superhero game. And so I guess my question really, from a devil's advocate standpoint is what is the problem with the familiar? I mean, a lot of people want to use them now, but what's the problem? So we want tips and tricks and we want to do things better, but what's the problem? I don't know, Eric, what are the things where you're running into familiars right now, or as a player, what do you think?
Well, I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later, right? But just to circle back to the main thing with familiars is that I mean, as a player, I'm a big familiar player. We'll put that up front here, and I think this is why it's an interesting dynamic here. And actually, in both of your games that I play in, or games that I've played in with Carl, I've actively had familiars, companions, etc. So I think this is a good time to discuss that. I mean, with you, James, I've had a familiar. I had an owl familiar, actually, which is an interesting topic with 5e concerned. And whether or not I played it differently, or the reasons I did it weren't the normal case, I think. And then for you, Carl, I had my resurrected dead grandfather as a zombie, and I had like a nano creature that I eventually got. So I personally often have them. I think there absolutely can be issues with it, both if we're talking about it from a, game neutral stance, there's a lot of cohesive issues across the board, either mechanically and role playing wise. And I think 5e specifically has a lot of issues, which they've been trying to rectify recently more and more, at least for companions and summons. But yeah, I mean, as far as tips go, I don't know how much we want to get into tips right now, but I mean, I think the main thing for a player, and I mean, with 5e, it's an issue, right? Because 5e, I think the problem with 5e mainly is that the familiars aren't balanced. And this is the problem with feats in 5e too. Is feats aren't balanced at all. And familiars are not balanced at all, right? There's clearly a superior one, which is the owl. And in a lot of cases, you can't really do much with a familiar in combat unless they're an owl. So it's just kind of one of those things that just gets taken a lot. They haven't made more of them. And I think... So that's a big problem with 5e. I think as a player, you should always have a familiar be part of your backstory. It should be part of, or it should narratively tie in. It should be organic. I mean, with you, James, my familiar, which was we reflavored an owl to be a jumping spider, flying gyroscopic helicopter drone, basically.
Drone. Let's call it a drone. It was a drone.
Who's a quirky little drone. And he was almost essential to my backstory as a kobold coming up in this a kind of underdog kobold, but almost extremely essential. And I didn't always risk him in combat, and we can talk about that, why we did that, and that's some tips from GM. So I don't want to. I think we maybe should move on from here, right? But I think as a GM,
and perhaps I should clarify a little bit. So. There's some different ways you can play this in terms of a familiar, and I guess I'd like to talk about both of them. The first is this kind of cute addition to your character, where you have a pet that could be a little squirrel that you walk around with and you have little conversations with, or you've got your little favorite turtle, or a stray cat that you've picked up along the way from a town. In fact, one of my kids did it a couple of weeks ago. I just want to find a cat because I like cats. Okay, then it becomes a role-playing thing that's part of the game. But as per any role-playing thing where there are rules around it, people will take that to the extent. And so I guess there's two sides of looking at this. There's that cute, story-driven, that's just a nice thing to have. And then there's the tactical, technical, I'm using companions in an effective kind of optimal way in order to make my character more effective generally. And in some ways, when we talk about the owl familiar in particular for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, because it has such a powerful owl. Sorry, you guys don't have powerful owls in. It's a type of owl in Australia. So from our Australian listeners, a powerful owl, insert knowing nature thing there. With an owl in particular, in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, they can enter combat, into a danger zone and have a flyby ability, which allows them to fly into danger but then immediately fly out of it with 0 consequence. So an owl can come in and claw at someone's face and distract them and then fly away without having any chance of a retaliation. So that's where the owl becomes problematic in some ways. So in some ways, I guess we're talking about, for two of them, talking about Carl's, what's the problem with them? Okay. I guess for me, why don't we talk about that now? Because I think that lets us then unpack some solutions for both players and Dungeon Masters about how to solve them. In my mind, there's 4 problems with familiars or animal companions that I guess I'd like to touch on a little bit. The first one is this idea of you use the companion as a scout, and this happens so much in a lot of role-playing games, not just Dungeons and Dragons. I've got a Call of Cthulhu player who has a monkey as an animal companion, because like an Indiana Jones kind of vibe, the monkey can open up a door, can scout in, can find the bad date, that kind of stuff. Okay, so for an animal companion, they make a fantastic scout. In 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, you can literally see through the eyes of this animal companion, so they can actually scout ahead, and the wizard or whoever owns the animal companion can see through their eyes. And so any traps, any threats, any issues will be experienced by the animal companion, but not necessarily by the players. And so for me, that creates some issues when you're playing a game. And the issues for me are twofold. The first one is there's no real risk to the group. But importantly, as a dungeon master, you end up kind of running the dungeon twice. You run it kind of when the animal goes through and then when the party goes through. I'm not sure if this is something that either of you have experienced in your games, but for me, it's an issue in terms of narrative and kind of talking through that.
So in like 5th edition or Call of Cthulhu, what kind of consequence is there when the familiar is hurt or damaged? Because immediately when you said that, first thing I thought as a dungeon master is, well, you've just put your familiar. You know, if a player was going to walk down the hallway and fall in a 10-foot pit with spikes and hurt themselves, literally that's what's going to happen to your familiar all by themselves with no one else around, surrounded by kobolds because there's no one else there, and they're going to beat it to a pulp. Problem solved. If there's consequences for losing your familiar, you know, it takes time. Well, you know, in Savage Worlds you get stunned, and you know there's things that happen there. But then the second part, running the dungeon twice, that's a tough one, right? I mean, that's the same thing if somebody's got spells that allow them to look ahead or pass through walls and other people can't, and things like that.
Arcane Eye or hacking a video camera or those kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, there is consequences. They're not that much. I mean, in 5e specifically, they can't take any damage if they have 1 hit point, so they go down instantly. And then it takes basically a spell slot, or you cast it as a ritual, which is 10 minutes or 11 minutes, I guess. And then you need 10 gold pieces worth of specific reagents, which are like incense. And a lot of GMs, you know, it's 5e, so they might play it fast and loose of it's easy to get those or not. And we can talk about that in the solutions part. But so not the biggest consequence, but can be. I mean, you know, in James' game where I had the familiar, I didn't have many, and I guess this is going to be a solution to that. I just didn't have access to a lot of the reagents. So while I used him in combat sometimes, I didn't risk him a lot. I would let him, you know, just kind of passively do a perception. The scouting thing is an interesting thing because I've experienced that sometimes, other times I haven't. And like you guys said, there's other abilities that do that, right? And like familiars or something, they should be able to have some utility or abilities. So I guess, I don't know if we want to talk about solutions, but I think certainly, you know, a familiar, even though, I mean, with D&D, it's 100 feet. Pathfinder plays it differently. With Pathfinder, they're tougher, but if they go down, it's a week of downtime. So there's a time cost that you just won't get it back.
Real consequence.
A week of downtime, yeah, but they're a lot tougher. I mean, they have 5 hit points per level, and they have a little bit better AC. But the way those work is it's much more open, which I like. Is that you say what kind of familiar you have, and then you give it. There's a whole list of abilities that you can apply to it, and the abilities are either like its own passive abilities or ones that you can get, like getting a single spell slot back or something. So you can really customize how the familiars work. And not a lot of them are just scouts. So, again, I think this is maybe Call of Cthulhu, but I think a lot of this is a 5e problem as far as that goes because
Call of Cthulhu has a weird thing with familiars, animal companions they call them. It's a strange dichotomy. It's used in the pulp version of the game, and I think directly as a response to bad dates. I think it's such a pulpy thing to have. You know, Tarzan having and even the Phantom having some kind of animal companions that work with them. But there's a specific mechanism in Call of Cthulhu that makes it very difficult. There is a protected attribute mechanism in Call of Cthulhu where each player gets to determine one thing that's sacrosanct, that is their safe place for their character. And I guess because it's such a horrific game, you want to have that one thing that you know isn't going to be affected. So, you know, please don't kill my daughter, or I really love my car, please don't blow up my car. It's kind of the one thing that you get to say, please, GM, don't mess with, because the rest of the game is so horrible. And if you dive into Animal Companion as a major concept for your character, what do you think's the one thing that you say, please don't kill my guy? Because, so for,
you don't kill the dog
players,
in the movie, right?
Yeah, so for the players that are invested into the Animal Companions, there's also this caveat, and you can't hurt them if that's all right. So it makes that whole thing just very, very difficult. I've knocked them out. I've had them so that they'll wake up, you know, hours later but unharmed. But it's still kind of like, for both Find Familiar and Animal Companions in Call of Cthulhu, it's a please don't. But there's also the other thing in terms of players get very attached to these creatures. unlike the hirelings in early edition Dungeons and Dragons, where you're like, well, there's a pit there, I guess you go first, Joe.
Cannon fodder.
Yeah.
And if you fall off, well, I'll just buy another one at the inn when we go when we go next time. Players are really emotionally attached to these things. I think they don't mind the fact that they're going to get attacked themselves. Please don't kill my kitten. And so that becomes a little bit tricky. Not just in kids' games, I've got to say. It's an emerging thing happening.
Of course. When you kill Godwin, you're a monster. Yeah, for sure.
That's right. Yeah.
But
when I target Godwin, I'm a monster.
I know, but that's fine because I actually roll with it. But let's circle back, I think, for some of those solutions you said to that specific problem. I think creating consequences, I think, actually role-playing out, like if you have a wizard who goes into and loses senses, right, and they're looking through it's only 100 feet. Things can happen like a large sound or a bright flash of light. Like you can interrupt that type of, if they're doing the thing where they're using it to scout and then move ahead, have them be, surprised from behind, right? Like move that fight around. Like you can kind of, doing it a little bit is fine, but once they start to over abuse that, throw some wrenches in there. Have the consequences, like have a trap for them if they're overusing it as a scout, or like I said, have them be ambushed from behind, or if the animal's going beyond the 100 feet, have the animal get scared and come back because something they saw. Never give the animal. It's animal intelligence, right? So it's not going to know necessarily. It's not just going to tell you, oh, there's 5 guys and one guy's manning a turret there and blah 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 or whatever, right? Like it role play it out as a big. The animal goes, it comes back, and this is kind of you get a sense of this. And it can't go any farther because it was scared or there's a smell or something. So I think you can definitely make roadblocks as a GM, and you can also provide consequences and throw wrenches in that can kind of disrupt the kind of double dipping of a dungeon exploration. I think is how I would say for that particular thing.
Yeah, I think that plays off of what I was talking about. They're going to encounter the things that the players would have encountered just by themselves. All alone, no one else around, because they're a scout.
Yeah, and James, like you did for 10 gold pieces isn't a lot, but I think moderating that. While 10 gold pieces isn't a lot, it may be hard to find those reagents. Like they're just not easy. They're not common, right? So make it hard for them to find that. So you can kind of.
Part of it, use spell components and don't hand wave them, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I guess that's true for some campaigns. If I look at some of the classic Dungeons and Dragons one, the Curse of Strahd, Rime of the Frost Maiden, the Fey Touch stuff where you're in the Feywild, makes these things hard to obtain. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I agree with that. Fair enough. That's the
first one. That was the first one.
Yeah, that was the first problem.
It's only the first one. Of course, this is all fun and games when they're exploring a dungeon, but when it all goes down and we're now in a combat. And we have now a battlefield, and we've got this extra annoying little bugger that's just kind of part of a fight, not part of a fight. If they're an owl, they're doubly annoying because they can fly in and out of a combat. If they're a protected monkey named Dingle, not that I've got one, but that's its name, called Dingle, but just happens to not be able to be killed in Call of Cthulhu, and so therefore can go right up to the big bad guy and scratch its face because we don't care about what happens to it. There's another complication here, and I guess this can be expanded out to all animal companions and all summoning spells in a lot of ways, in that these additional NPCs being dropped on the battlefield does cause complication. There's no question. It does a couple of things in my mind. That one player who has it, they're effectively getting twice the turns in a lot of ways. If you think about a combat, and if you think about their time in the spotlight, in Eric's case, potentially 4 times the turns because of his latest iteration of his Dungeons and Dragons character. But he's an outlier. The other one is that the concept of, if I now have this extra player in the combat, okay, they might just be niggling. They might be doing something. They might have the extra perceptive ability of seeing the battleground. But I'm in a fight for my life as the monster, as the bad guy, as the villain.
Yeah.
Do I really spend my action to take that thing out?
No.
But I've got all these other bigger, tougher things coming at me. But if I don't take it out, it's just going to annoy me every round for an entire battle.
Yeah.
So at what point do you go, there's these things in the battleground that aren't big threats, but they are constant threats. And how do you manage that? How do you do it so that you're not you don't just have this omnipresence of annoying NPCs adding to the complexity of an already complicated battle?
Yeah.
Go on, Carl.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I think that was that's a problem, right? Is the action economy and the way you've built these encounters are based on this kind of understanding. And now if you do have somebody pulling up and you've got twice as many characters, even if they're smaller, your action economy, the speed of combat, everything kind of goes downhill. But from what does the big bad guy do, right? Or the minions do? It really comes down to how you were talking about these things are just kind of niggling and getting in your way. But, in some games, they may not be that powerful, but if they get a hit, they could, with things like exploding dice and Savage Worlds, it could be a big deal. So your bad guy is always constantly making a judgment call. This thing is closer to me now. Those guys aren't. It's not as powerful, but that's what I want to attack. I guess I really don't like that it changes the action economy. I'm kind of with the goddamn familiars thing because it adds a lot. When Eric's in my game and he had his grandpa who was the undead soldier, that guy was effective. And so they literally really had another person who could do significant work that would take somebody's attention.
Yeah. But I did put some of my PowerPoints into that power.
Oh no, and I'm not saying that he was not a good, well-designed, interesting character. He just was indeed someone who truly was
for sure
formidable, not just an annoyance, right?
Yeah, but that's like superhero companion. Yeah.
So the bad guys in that campaign had to make the decision if they were going to go after him or not, even though taking him out doesn't have that great of a consequence. From a meta, I'd be better off going after the players because from a meta thought, that actually does real damage. If I take out your grandpa, he can come back later. It's kind of a pain now, but it's not fundamental.
There wasn't a lot of consequences in that for sure.
Yeah. So, but the creature's got to make, from a game master, you got to make your decisions based on what really is a problem right now. And I can't solve the people getting attached to their familiars. That's on them. If you're going to put your puppy in danger and have the puppy run up and try to bite somebody, if the guy kicks them, I don't know what to tell you. You told your puppy to go take out the guy. So that's part of the consequence.
Carl. I think that's it. I think a lot of it does depend on the game, right? We talked a little bit about, Pathfinder does it, how it does differently. Pathfinder, you spend you have 3 actions in Pathfinder. You spend one of your actions on any minion, so familiars or animal companions, then they get 2 actions. So it's kind of you're sacrificing one of your actions to give them 2 actions, which includes moving. But then I played other games like Barbarian. I think it's like Apocalypse Engine or Barbarians of Lemuria, I think it's called, and their take on that is much more narrative, where you take it as part of your character, your mechanics or leveling up stuff, but it kind of gives you more of a passive bonus. It's not really an active participant. But when we talk about active participants, I think you guys pretty much hit it on the head. I think if a player is using their character in combat, it's fair game, right? Completely fair game. I think with kids, probably play it a little easier on if they're attacking with it, it's fair game, right? If you're just using it to get the help action, I think generally, mostly try to avoid just directly attacking it. I think the thing with GMs here is that, like you guys were talking, but really, even if it's annoying you as a GM, only target it if it would make sense for that NPC to do it. Killing off the familiar because you're annoyed as a GM isn't a good way to do it. If you're annoyed as it for a GM and it's causing disruptions, talk to the player about it separately after the game.
Oh yeah,
don't in game, murder the thing, because even if it is an issue for the game and the party, like don't do it that way. Always kind of role play it out, right?
And Eric gives good advice. Eric gives good advice. Always have adult conversations and good conversations with your players. This was brought to you by Eric, the advice column.
Honestly, that's kind of the answer to a lot of things, is just people need to be more open and communicative and honest, with things like that. But I think that's, never take it out on them in character if it doesn't make sense. But like you said, James, while the big bad might not directly attack it, it might throw a fireball that would hit maybe only one of the players in that thing because it's annoying them, right? Eventually, because it's annoying. So I think you can play it in a way where, let them do. With a familiar, you might let them do a reflex. If they're flying in the air, maybe them do a reflex. Even if it doesn't have, evasion, give it evasion for that or something. Just like if it can, it doesn't have good
Dodge
stats.
out.
So
Let it dodge out.
let it have
Yeah.
a chance to like survive because it only has 1 hit point. So that's personally how I see it should be done. But I think generally, I think we all.
I tend to agree. I run it a little bit with two ways in terms of when an NPC or a non-combatant, an evil guy sees a familiar. There's 3 types of bad guys when it comes to a familiar for me. The first one is a spellcaster who knows about them, that knows what they do, knows how annoying they can be. Another wizard that might have one. And in my mind, they just get rid of them. They're like, yep, that's it. Cantrip, firebolt, it's gone. Like they'll just use that one action because they understand what the issue is. So they go, yep, that's a problem. Getting rid of that. That's over. The normal monster, the gnoll and the orc, they don't care. Like that's not a problem. I don't care about it. Even the dragon, I don't care about it. That's puny. The other one that I like to use, which is pretty funny, is the low intelligence monster. It's the ogre going, oh, annoying, oh, that's annoying. They get distracted by it and then fixated on it. So, but that becomes a narrative thing where, and particularly with kids, they think that's hilarious. That the big lumbering dumb hill giants not fighting them anymore. They're chasing the dumb birdie that's in their face and kind of making a fool of themselves. So I find that's kind of the 3 ways to insert myself into the non-player character with those.
So if you got 2 wizards with familiars, it's a Pokemon thing. You need to pull them out and have their own little battle. The familiars against each other.
Oh, I'm totally going to use that. That's great.
That's funny. I think, James, what you said about the stupid orc, I think if you are going to have your NPC like attack the familiar, I think another good thing is to have, role play that out, that it starts to, I see, like they do it too many times, have that orc, state that it starts to look at the familiar with a look of annoyance, kind of giving them the hint that if you do it again, it's going to attack it, so always have the role playing inform your kind of what your character is going to do if it's going to attack a familiar.
And of course, this escalates in a lot of ways. So yes, familiars is one example, but there are summoning spells that allow you to summon creatures. There's, you have your, you can have demons that do your bidding. There are rangers will get beast companions if they choose to do so. That holds that whole kind of ranger plus wolf kind of duo. And these things can escalate. I had an experience at the end of Rime of the Frost Maiden last year where just because everyone knew it was the final showdown with the boss and that we weren't going to continue on those characters after their campaign, they knew that this was their last chance. And so all my players, there were 6 players, summoned 19 extra non-player creatures onto the battlefield to kind of fight against the final boss, which turned out this kind of nice, you've got 6 turns, bad guy's got 1 turn, you guys have 25 turns, bad guy has 1 turn. And look, Rime of the Frost Maiden wasn't so bad. I just summoned a massive sleet storm and wiped out half the battlefield, which was horrific for the players. But these things can get out of control in 5th edition. Particularly, there's so many things that can bring things onto the battlefield for you. So it does become a problem.
In other games, too, I mean, I think 5e now is going the way that Pathfinder 2e does it, where a lot of the summons are just going to be like, it's just one creature that has like variable things. You can have 1 creature like that at the time. And so that's what I think 5e is going. I think for a GM, if you are experiencing these issues in your game, again, have a discussion with the players and put a limit. Like, put a limit per player. You can have 2 things. That's it. Like, that is perfectly reasonable and fine because it does, like you said, it slows down combat, it slows down game, it slows down a lot of things. It can be disruptive. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to have those limits if you need it. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I absolutely have home rules about how these things should be managed. In some ways, for one of the side issues of this, of course, is other players can find this exceptionally boring. Where you're sitting there and you're waiting for someone to have their turn and their other thing. And in some ways, for me, as a kind of solution, is if you are a player that uses these extra companions, there's 2 pieces of advice. In some ways, it's read the room a bit. If everyone's getting a bit frustrated with the fact that you're taking a long time, and you need to be a little bit cognizant of the time that you're taking up at the table. The other thing is you don't have to use these things every combat. You don't have to use these things every round. Really think about, is this familiar, is this companion adding anything to the encounter or to the combat? If you don't actually need the help action, or you don't need to, there's a lot of, so what's your companion doing? I'm not sure if that, if you end up in one of those situations where you don't actually know for certain what this NPC will do with you in that fight, you don't have to use them. They stay by my side, and we just kind of, we'll you don't need to use them every round. It's kind of some advice. Often there's a lot of, deliberations about what it is you're going to use these guys for. And if you don't really know what you're using them for, don't use them.
And that behavior is going to be driven a little bit like we were talking about. If having them in combat constantly annoying the ogre causes consequences, they will more likely, if this is not important for me, I'm going to have my buddy stick with me and not go out there in the middle of combat, because I know it can be dangerous, for them, because the game master has demonstrated it can be dangerous for them. And so now the player, again, goes back to consequence. If there's no consequence, they're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again because there's no consequences. Okay. It makes a lot of sense.
So for me, and that's a good point, James, because I think about maybe we can bring up like me in your game or something. Like we went the whole gamut of this. I had an Hell Familiar, right? I've had one. And like with him, you have those consequences in place. I didn't always use it. Oftentimes I'd just be like, he's up there. If anybody tries to surprise us, that's what he's looking for. So I have his fallback thing of what he would do, of being like a drone and just being like, he's up there, we can skip his turns if we need, like he's just looking for other things. And then we would move on. And then you would have him roll or ask me to roll for him if you needed to. So I think that is a really good piece of advice, and then just have your fallback thing that they do, which often is probably like look out for trouble or, stay, something like that, or bring a message to somebody or something. So,
or stand in the doorway and just and defend the door.
Yeah, which I did last session with you.
Yeah.
So,
And so, in a lot of ways, the onus is then put on the player. Have a plan for what you're going to do with them, and kind of the greatest piece of advice in any role playing game is when it comes up to your turn, know what you're going to do before they say it's your turn. But incorporate that into it so that you can say, well, I'm going to do this, and my familiar's going to do that, and just kind of make it as fast and painless and easy and streamlined as you can, because it's boring and it's lame when it sucks up too much time and too much energy in the table.
I think Eric hit an interesting point when he talked about his creature was just flying around, and he just said, well, they're just going to fly around looking for stuff. Is that something you can work with players with in different games and say, is there something your familiar's always doing? So when it comes to their turn, it's already understood that they're going to be finding the closest extra guy and nibbling on them. And so you don't have to. It happens, and you roll at the same time you're rolling yours, and you move on.
Great advice. Absolutely great advice. Yep.
Yeah, and that's what those other games I talked about, which they just are a narrative thing, or they're a passive benefit that they just kind of do this, and they're not an active participant. And I think you can apply that to games where they are active participants. So yeah.
And I will say, look, and this is a 5th edition specific thing too. One thing that I've only now and honestly, the last game that we played together, Eric, it just solidified this in my mind. Shifting familiars so they don't have their own initiative, but they go either before or after their controller.
Yes, makes it way
I think
easier.
will stream like this a lot more. I'm guilty all the time of missing familiars' turns in combat because in my mind I don't care. It's like whatever. It's just that little annoying thing, right? And so having it all part of the same player's turn, all at the same time, but they can choose whether it's before the wizard acts or after the wizard acts.
Yeah,
I think it's probably
and it's a little bit stronger, but it's so much more streamlined that you should just let. Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's how I rule it. Are we talking more about player stuff, or do you want to move on to a different subject?
Well, for me, yeah. I guess let's move on. They're all the things that are wrong with them, and they are many and varied. I'm piling it on a bit, but I have a love-hate relationship with my players and with my players. That sounds awful. I have a love-hate relationship with my players' familiars.
Sounds like a hate, really, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But okay.
It's just mostly hate. Murder hate.
But one thing I do love about them when they're done well is storytelling. It's if you can come up with a wonderful personality, or if you can come up with a wonderful bit about your familiar and use it judiciously and have it part of the drama. It's really amazing when it happens. Animals and pets can be really powerful emotional tools as a comfort to a character that might be going through sorrow, or as a comedic breaking of a mood, if it's done really, really well. And I guess, talking player-wise, but even as a storyteller, yes, they add complications to the mechanics of the game. How do you think that they work in terms of the narrative element of the game? What do they bring, and what are some tips that you might be able to use there?
I mean,
how do you make them cool?
I absolutely love their narrative component. And just touching back quickly, when I know, I think you maybe mentioned it. I know it's in the notes about optimization versus narrative. I don't think those are mutually exclusive, like, personally. I mean, and this is something that me and Carl have talked about before, about optimizing versus min-maxing, right? I think that how I play, at least, I always like to have my character concept and then optimize it to that. Try to make, like, the best iteration of that character concept. I kind of come at it from two angles, and I feel that way with familiars or animal companions too. And with I mean, just talking about Bisbo and Godwin, right? Like, Bisbo again. Like, I think a tip for players, and first of all,
we should explain. Bisbo is Eric's kobold artificer who makes these fantastic inventions that torture me weekly.
Well, I think, I mean, first as a GM, encourage players to wrap it into their narrative, because familiars really do help with player immersion and help with a player, buying into the world. Like, they emotionally are going to be more invested in the world because they have these connections that are real. Often when we talk about, like, when we write our backgrounds and we have, like, an uncle or something that we just write down, we really don't have an emotional component with that uncle because we haven't interacted with them. They're really not three-dimensional characters. A familiar that you've developed that has a personality becomes a three-dimensional character and an emotional investment for you and the party. I mean, Godwin, I feel like, I don't want to be talking, I feel like he became kind of the, what's the word I'm looking for? The token, like,
mascot.
Yeah, mascot. Thank you. The mascot of that party. I mean, I felt like he became that way.
Yeah.
And part of it was, like, I think with familiars, you should have them, put them into your background. And this also goes to our role-playing episode. Give them a flaw, give them a dream. Like, they can have the same, even if they have lesser intelligence, they can have those breadth of things. And then their quirks, and something like, and again, it's going to evolve as you play. Like, Godwin, my little scout, I think kind of naturally evolved, partly because of the character artwork. He evolved that his thing is sewing. And that became, like, a big thing where he would fix things or want to build things. And then that actually further inspired me when my character got ritual casting, that I incorporated his sewing, that the whole reason that he could sew was because originally I built him to magically sew, like, these magical kind of, temporary constructs. Those are my ritual spells. He would actually, sew the alarm or sew the invisible servant.
Like a 3D printing.
Exactly, like a 3D printing magical thread. And that was completely just, me and James kind of role-playing, bouncing each other back, my background story, and interacting with the world. So they can become this really pivotal three-dimensional thing. So I think, that's a big thing for me, is give them the personality, give them their flaws, give them their dreams. And as a GM, you should encourage that. Carl, any suggestions for you?
Well, I have not played a lot of characters that had familiars, but I think if I was to have a companion or something like that, I would definitely want to make them unique and interesting and not just set dressing. Right, I feel like when I have played with some folks, not you, Eric, but I have played in the past. Again, familiars were just their additional attack, so now I have another attack, and I can do some stuff. And great! I think it'd be for myself. I'd want to have them to be a three-dimensional, like you said, but with flaws. And they're going to run away when certain things happen, even though that would not be optimal for my character, just because they're. It's a puppy. Puppy's not going to run and try to chase that guy. Puppy's going to run away the other way or snuggle up with somebody who looks cute, even though they're supposed to be the bad guy. I don't know. It'd be kind of interesting. So as a player, I probably would do that. But honestly, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about getting extra people to go along with me. I think I should. I think I don't play enough, but I think I should. Hearing about Godwin or whatever the guy's name was or whatever, I think I want one of those. Come on, I want one of those.
Yeah, he's a fun. I think the inverse of this, though, as like a red flag for this, is that you don't want to overuse it. And I'm not talking about combat. I'm talking about role playing. There is a fine line, and you guys can tell me if I was been successful or not with these characters. But you don't want to overuse it.
He's completely dominated our story. It's the Godwin Tales.
So are you role playing with yourself? Were you talking to yourself? Is that what was going on?
That's a second thing too. Is that be very, very careful with speech. Now, different games have different abilities to give them speech. Personally, I do not like giving my thing speech at all, because you get into those weird situations with talking to yourself or having the GM talk, then they don't do it properly and how you envisioned it, and it's just too much. You can do it, but you have to be very careful. If they do speak, have them speak not that much. I think that is always the good thing to fall on. With Godwin, I basically have him, he's like a droid from Star Wars, so he makes beeps and twirls. I can sort of understand him, and I mainly have him emote. I gave him like eyes that he can oscillate, or like a aperture eyes that he can kind of use to emote things. And that's how he communicates. So I think that's a really, really big line to draw is having him speak is something you should really consider. Like Pathfinder has the ability to maybe give them just the ability to speak. And that's something you definitely want to, is it cool with the party? Because you have to really hold it back when they speak. And if you're having issues with how, again, if you're having issues with it, if the party's having issues, if the GM's doing stuff to it, talk to them, because you can usually work something out.
Eric has advice. Have those adult conversations. Talk to each other. Good advice. I think we could just say.
It's often lacking, though. I mean, it's often lacking.
No, it's absolutely right. I'm not joking with you. That is awesome advice. That's why I'm keep calling it out. So,
some of the best times that I've seen familiars used, and it's really interesting. It's and this is some advice for some dungeon masters too about how you might include these creatures within your game. I remember the names of characters' familiars, which is an important thing. If a dungeon master can remember the names of a player's familiars, then both you and the player's probably done it right. Yeah, so I've got Godwin and Phineas and Digby and Nibbles and Snowy, kind of the 5 top of brain things that of familiars that have worked really, really well. The one effective thing I think I do when I run DM familiars is have the world react to the familiar in a role-playing sense, not necessarily a combat sense. So Digby, the monkey that can't be killed, is set in the late 1920s, and they're globe-trotting players. And so she's the player character that owns Digby is a burglar, a cat burglar, a jewel thief. But by day, it's just kind of this glamorous girl that just walks around in fur coats and that kind of stuff. And the world is constantly amazed to her, no matter where she goes. Is that a monkey? Is kind of the opening thing that most non-player characters will say to this player every time that she interacts in a social scene, because a quite rich-looking woman with a monkey on her shoulder is extraordinary in 1926 New York or Egypt even, or anywhere around the world. And so it drives the character, and it's a reminder to the player of, yes, this is a big part of your character, and this is an obvious part. Godwin is, for example, because we run a game in the Feywild, a robotic drone in the Feywild is a source of extraordinary disruption. People want it. Like, oh my God, that is the most valuable object that I've ever seen. I want to steal that.
That was a big issue.
It becomes a fixated thing where it's like, would you look at this thing? Nobles must possess Godwin. Drives the story where protecting or concealing Godwin becomes a thing, because otherwise they're going to want to steal it from me, which is really interesting. I had a wizard play a character called Phineas who was a bat, but a spiritual kind of fading into the spirit world bat in the middle of a Curse of Strahd game. People were very superstitious about this creature, but he didn't downplay it. And Phineas had its own personalities where it'll like nibble someone's ear and things, which freaked people out. So make sure that as a player you try and include the narrative elements of it, but as a dungeon master, have the world react to it. Often when the player doesn't expect that to be a thing. We walk into the tavern. Well, is that a bloody robot? Have it drive it and upend the narrative in some ways, just so that there's an extra consequence there and drive the story a bit more.
You robot kinds aren't allowed in this here bar. You got to be outside.
Exactly. That's right. Absolutely. We've got an open carry familiar policy here.
Yeah.
It's like,
Right to refuse service. No shirt, no shoes, robot parts, no service.
oh, no shirt, no shoes, no familiars. Oh my God, I can put that up in taverns around
no,
my
why did
world.
they give you this? No. Yeah, that's a really good point, James. I actually had the same thing written down too, is that use them as a narrative device. And yeah, what you did was excellent. It was really, really cool to have them. And then push my character to the kind of limits of being like, well, what am I going to now do to like, the whole party was actually like, what are we going to do to get him out of this? We don't want this to happen because he became this kind of beloved figure. So that was a really cool, really, really, really cool and rewarding experience. Yeah, and I mean, and if a player's open to it, again, talk to them about it beforehand, but maybe have them be like, I want to kidnap your familiar. Like that could start an adventure, right? So I think there's a lot of things you can do with familiars more than just have them be a mechanical thing. But I just want to touch one thing is that it's okay for them to be a mechanical thing too, because, 5e at least is right. It's a very mechanical game. It's based on tabletop, like wargaming. So there is a lot of their systems compared to other games is very mechanical, is very, these stats and a familiar, like given the option, you should never make a player feel bad for taking an option. If it's an issue, that's something separate, but you should never make them feel bad because this is something the game is providing. You know what I mean? Like this is an option that's available to wizards as part of their kit. So, like an arcane trickster rogue, right, is probably going to want a familiar if there's no front line because how else are they going to get sneak attack? You know what I mean? So it's a thing that's there and obviously unbalanced in 5e, but I think there's things you can even do with 5e, like give the flyby ability to other things, or take it away from Owl and give them something else, or add in new familiars that have interesting kind of things. I think you can do a lot with that too.
And there are resources out there, maybe not official ones, but there's a heap of third-party resources with much more expanded rules and things for familiars, absolutely. And I often like that. Going back a bit about your speaking parts for NPCs and whether you allow it and whether you don't. My rule is the Dungeon Master speaks for any NPC, even a player-led NPC. And it allows for some fun then. So if you're using your retainer, your trusty chauffeur or something in a more modern game, your Alfred, you get to dictate what they do, but Alfred can advise, but also can push back a little bit. I've got a fantastic warlock with a very wisecracking closet that just argues back to him on any command. I need you to do this. Well, why would I do it? Why would I want to do that? In this kind of obnoxious New Yorker stand-up argument, which becomes part of that character fun of that character because he was playing a really kind of emo-like broody warlock, and I just went, I've got to change that a bit and have a familiar that talks back to you, and you have these horrendous arguments all the time, which is good fun.
Definitely, you've seen that in a lot of good TV and shows where the little companion is not just there to cause problems. To be honest,
yeah, they're not your slave. They have their own personality. Yep. They have their own.
Yep,
it's a big agency. Disney thing, isn't it? It's the Mulan dragon or the Aladdin genie. You make the extra one bigger than life for sure. That's it.
All right, so what do you think? Do you guys have any last thoughts? Good conversation so far. Sounds good? All right.
Sounds good. Look, I might just reiterate, I guess some of the big ones is give them personalities, add them to the narrative. If they're not adding anything, particularly in combat, don't feel like you have to use them all the time. And if you do control more than one character, be nice to your other players, be nice to your Dungeon Master, and be quick. Make those decisions quicker and kind of don't drag down the game. They're my kind of last little bits, really.
Oh, excellent. Nicely summarized. Appreciate that. All right. Hey, thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you got something out of it. And remember to drop by masteringtherepg.com, all one word, and learn more about the projects and the team here that's been talking at you. And if you like the show, please give a good review. I would say just review, but please give a good review at the podcatcher of your choice. We are on Apple, Google, and Spotify now, so you can pretty much catch us on all the popular stuff. So thank you much, and thank you guys. Another great conversation, and we'll catch you guys next time.